As was mentioned, my name is Chard. I'm a researcher at the University of Chicago and Argonne National Lab. I'm going to present the work of many people, some of whom I've included here as authors. I'd like to especially call out the first two, Yadu and Anna, who are the lead developers who have done 99% of the work here. So, in our role at the University of Chicago and Argonne, we deal with a lot of researchers in very different domains, from biomedicine to material science to social science to archaeology. And one thing that we increasingly notice is the sort of common story of things that these people need out of cyber infrastructure and sort of distributed computing environments. So the first one we hear a lot is, I'm a developer, I'm trying to build an application, and I need to link together a bunch of external tools that might do something like genome analysis, they might do something like calculating the properties of a material, the direction of particles through whatever. And I need to link them together in some sort of seamless way with little bits of Python or other functions that glue together these different steps. And most often what they're actually asking for is the sort of data flowy type concept, this idea of one application will execute as the result of the data from a prior application. The second thing that we've been hearing over the last probably 3, 4, 5 years is I've got this notebook, it works really well on my laptop, now I want to take it to Argonne and run it on a supercomputer. And of course that proves to be quite difficult. Interestingly, it started, I think a lot of social scientists used to ask us this question probably several years ago. And increasingly over the last couple of years, we've got a lot more of these people that are already fairly adept at running large-scale analyses on supercomputers who are actually coming to us with their big notebooks saying, I need to run this thing at scale. And there's not really a very good way to do that at the moment. And the final thing I think we hear a lot, in our world at least, is that I've got these applications, I've run them on some toy data sets on my laptop, now I want to use this several terabyte data set that happens to sit at NERSC, or I need to run this other big data set, maybe hundreds of terabytes that sits in some sequencing center somewhere else, and I want to be able to sort of seamlessly stage that data in, compute what I need to compute, and then get rid of it. And the final thing that I sort of wanted to call out here is that I want to be able to do this in an interactive way. I don't want to write a script, submit it to someone to actually run on a supercomputer. I want to sit there actually engaging with my data, engaging with my analyses as they go. So I thought I would start by summarizing what Parsl is. So Parsl is a Python, it stands for the Parallel Scripting Library. It's a Python-based library for supporting the development of these sort of data flow-based workflows. So the idea is fairly simple. We've come at it from, let's try and stay as close to Python as we can, let's try and be as sort of inobtrusive as possible, allow people to mark up functions that they might wish to run in parallel, adhering to sort of data dependencies that might exist between these functions. We've got two sort of primary building blocks. The first is a Python app, so essentially just any old Python function. Put your code in there and you might want to run that in parallel. And the second one is a bash app, which essentially uses bash to call an external application. It could be a script, it could be a binary, it could be whatever you want. There are examples there on the right of the screen of what a Python app and what a bash app looks like. The idea is that these apps return futures. I think people are probably well aware of what a future is. It's a proxy for a result that will be coming at some point in the future. We don't yet know if it's available, but it will be there at some point in the future. And these apps can essentially run concurrently. So once I've defined these apps, I string them together with normal Python code, calling these apps, calling them in loops. Essentially, those apps will fire off to a big machine, run in parallel, assuming there's no sort of shared dependencies between them. So the idea is you get this sort of natural parallel programming construct without needing to go through all the sort of hard, low-level details of trying to orchestrate that all yourself. And one big advantage of Parsl is that the idea of independence in terms of location. So Parsl scripts are completely independent of where they run. You can take the same script and run it on your laptop using threads. You can then scale it up to work on a cluster using maybe a pilot job model, and then you can even take it to a more extreme scale system using a sort of extreme scale scheduling fabric that our team's developed. So another focus, I think, of research at the moment is that the idea of scientific workflows is no longer just sort of that mini-task, HPC, HTC type modality. I think we're seeing these types of workflows being developed in a range of different places. So these are examples of where I see them. I'm sure you see workflows in very different places than that, but I think the sort of common ideas are there. So the first one I wanted to call out is online computing. So this idea of acquiring data at some source, say the light source at Argonne or out here in I don't know what resources you have out here. I'm sure you've got some big instruments in Texas that are producing data very quickly, and there's this need to sort of take that data, analyze it in some way so we can help steer experiments, so we can work out when there are issues, so that we can perform quality control, we can perform center finding, we can perform sort of rudimentary analysis to give feedback to researchers to understand, should they be turning samples, should they be changing samples, is there some sort of misconfiguration of their equipment. The second one, which I think we just heard a ton about, is the need for workflows in machine learning. So machine learning workflows, I think you're starting to see that there's this need to sort of pre-process data, shape it in different ways, run sort of parameter sweeps to try and do hyperparameter tuning. And then when you actually come to the prediction phase, these are most often sort of embarrassingly parallel predictions, where you might want to do some N by M matrix of materials that you want to run through your prediction model and see what properties you're pulling out of it. And then the final one is sort of what we're talking about here, is interactive computing. So this idea of being able to sort of iterate, perform analyses as you go, fire off things that actually might need to run on bigger machines. So this example here is an interesting student learning environment where they allow people to basically stand up detectors in their high schools, retrieve the data from those detectors, and then build notebooks so that they can actually iterate over those analyses, combining the data they've found themselves with data that's published online, with data published from other schools. So here I'd just like to show a quick example of what a Parsl script actually looks like. So this is a very common, I think, example of where an embarrassingly parallel execution, protein docking, where you've got some number of proteins that are associated with a disease. You've got some much larger number of drug candidates that potentially could be useful for that disease. You want to run an analysis of all of those drug candidates against all of those proteins and work out the ones that are sort of the highest probability of actually being useful for further experimentation at the actual biological level. If we look at how we actually implement that in Parsl, basically we define, so this is a bash app here, we define a docking function which essentially just wraps a call out to an external script, some binary application that needs to be executed many times. We define the signature, what arguments need to be passed in, and then we can link it together in a for loop where we just iterate over that sort of embarrassingly parallel problem space. We say for every protein, for every ligand, go and fill up a 2D array of all of these docking calculations, and then we might graph it or look for min or max in that data set. So in terms of how we got to this point, so our team's been working on parallel workflows for 10 plus years. So in the early 2000s, we developed an implicitly parallel scripting language called Swift. Of course, names changed recently because Apple came and developed their own programming language called Swift. But you'll see here we have an example on the right of this sort of C-like language for expressing these types of workflows, where you essentially, like you saw with Parsl, you wrap these apps that need to execute in parallel, and then you write this domain-specific language where everything's implicitly parallel, with variable assignments in parallel, every call to an application's in parallel, and there's this implicit sort of data management, data dependency stuff that goes on behind the scenes to assemble this graph and control execution. So what we've done with Parsl is we've tried to bring the Swift capabilities a lot closer to the users by, instead of requiring people to learn a new language, which is C-like, we're allowing them to basically express their workflows in Python with as minimal of sort of changes as we can. So now we'll get back to Parsl. So if we look at the way Parsl actually works, so unlike a lot of workflow systems which require you to sort of pre-compile a graph, they ask you to sort of define a graph of here are all the steps I need to run, here are the data dependencies between them. We instead have this sort of more dynamic graph model where we allow this graph to evolve over time depending on what results we've had from previous apps. So an app can spawn more apps, etc. So if we look at what this looks like, if we have some Python script up the top, which might be in Jupyter, it might be just a Python script that's sitting on a machine somewhere. We have some execution resources down the bottom there. Bluewater's a big machine at UIUC, Amazon, Exceed resources, and sort of some data staging fabric between them. So we have data resources off to the side that may not necessarily actually be resident on the machines in which we want to execute things. So as this Python script is executing, essentially we start to build up this graph. So every call to one of these apps will go into the graph where we assign a dependency based on those shared data products from the prior app to the app that actually needs to execute. As soon as any of these apps are seen to Parsl, if there are no dependencies, they'll essentially be pushed down to the execution resources to execute. They'll spin for a while, come back with results, and then we'll start to complete the rest of the graph that was dependent on those tasks to execute. And of course, they'll still be pushed down to the execution resources. In terms of highlights, so the first one that I always like to call out to people when I'm presenting Parsl is it's pure Python, so there's no need to install anything else. The entire Parsl library can be pip installed. You can plug this into an existing Python script by going and adding some decorators to your applications or your functions that exist in there. You can use Python libraries natively. We handle the staging of Python objects down to the execution resources and Python objects coming back again to you. So there's no need for you to really go in and cut your code apart and redevelop from scratch. Instead, you're just sort of augmenting what you've already got. The second thing I like to highlight is the independence from execution provider. So essentially allowing the same Parsl script to be run locally on grids, clouds, supercomputers. It works directly with the scheduler, so there's no need to sort of install some HTC-like model on top of it. We can talk to Slurm, we can talk to AWS. There's no need for you to actually install infrastructure there necessarily to execute things. We can use containers, so we can speak to Docker and Singularity containers for wrapping sort of one app that you might want to run in a container, but also for spinning up a container and then pumping jobs to it, so you don't need to go through that overhead of continually setting up infrastructure to execute. We found that, so we built out this capability to speak to a bunch of different schedulers, a pure Python library for speaking to schedulers, and we got asked by many people if we can fork that off so they could just use that bit. So we've released this little library called libsubmit, which includes wrappers for speaking to different resources. It's a very simple interface, essentially put job, cancel job, find out the status of your job. You're all welcome to have a look at that and use it for your own needs. And I've put an assortment here of some of the resources that we're currently running Parsl on, obviously with a slight bend towards some of these sort of leadership class machines that we work with at Argonne. In terms of how we actually achieve this separation of code and execution, that's done through a configuration file. We provide some configuration files for machines that we use a lot, but it's actually relatively easy to create your own configuration file. This example here, I'm not sure if you can see this with the size, shows how we can combine two types of execution resources that are used by the same script. So the top one is using a pilot job model deployed on a cluster at the University of Chicago. It includes information saying it uses Slurm. Here's how I connect to it over SSH. Here's some information about the number of resources that I want to allow Parsl to provision, where we're using an elastic model based on the actual requirements of the workload, depending on how wide or narrow that graph gets at the time. So you can sort of define, here's the minimum size of my allocation, here's the maximum size, here's how aggressively I want you to go and provision resources. And we can put some overrides in there saying, in this example, that we want to use Singularity, we want to use Conda, we need to activate a Conda environment to actually have all of our dependencies there. And then the second executor is just a thread-based executor where we're provisioning some sort of threads locally for sort of smaller tasks that we can actually execute locally, and we just say we want a couple of threads for that. When it comes to actually defining the sort of mapping between your apps and those resources, you can annotate on the app definition what resources you might be interested in running those things on. You can say everything, you can say nothing. Often people will use this if they have some apps that need to run on GPUs, some apps that need to run on CPUs, some apps that are sort of very quick little tasks that could be run on threads. And also there's some I guess, hint-based model where users can probably avoid using multiple machines if they know there's going to be a huge amount of data that needs to cross between two apps. So you might want to co-locate things on the same machine. So one of the big advantages we've found with using Parsl is that it enables people to actually scale their Jupyter notebooks. So essentially they can write their Jupyter notebooks as they do currently, they can annotate the apps in that Jupyter notebook, and then they can submit them from that notebook sitting wherever it might sit. We've done a bunch of work trying to support sort of transparent SSH tunneling with an OAuth-based model, so we can have a sort of native app type model where the Python script can actually go and provision tokens that can then be used to SSH to particular resources. One of the big advantages of using Jupyter is the support for visualization. So we've had a couple of students spend some time trying to visualize the graph as it is at the time within the Jupyter environment. So I think I've alluded to this already, but we can't just speak to a bunch of different execution resources without also speaking a bunch of different ways of how we actually get jobs onto machines. So at the simplest level, threads, being able to run things in multiple threads on one machine. A sort of slightly more complicated model is using a pilot job model, which I have a little graphic that illustrates. So essentially a pilot job model works by Parsl submitting a job request to the job queue through the scheduler. That'll go and provision some block of nodes. we'll then deploy sort of worker functionality on those nodes and then push down tasks directly to the nodes with provision. So what this does is it avoids the need for us to go through the queue and provision a big block of resources, and instead we can sort of provision it and then start pumping it full of tasks as quickly as we can. And we also support this, this extreme scale model, Swift-T. So that's a model that our group has built that's basically, you can think of it as a distributed, decentralized scheduling model where we fan out an MPI job to actually do the job placement and execution on a very large machine. So if you want to actually fill a petaflop machine or more, quite often you can't pump tasks as quickly as you need to fill up the nodes you've got. So being able to distribute that and create jobs through this decentralized sort of model is the only way of actually doing it. And of course, other execution models can be added. We're working with some researchers at Notre Dame to try and add their pilot job model to the system. Authentication, authorization. So often when you see talks like this about actually running things on big machines, we'll talk about the easy stuff without talking about the hard stuff. Actually being able to submit jobs to a leadership class machine is not as trivial as just running a Python script on your laptop. There's a few barriers, a few hoops you have to jump through. In general, I would say authentication authorization is a real pain. You've got to deal with two-factor, you've got to deal with X509 certificates, you've got to deal with a bunch of junk that you don't really want to deal with. So what we've done is we've integrated Parsl with the Globus Auth fabric. So Globus Auth is an OAuth 2-based authentication authorization system. Essentially, it's trying to rethink the old sort of grid security model into a new web-based OAuth model. So you can define your Parsl script, you can go and retrieve sort of OAuth tokens to access Globus services for data management, access tokens for submitting to Globus compliant SSH services, so that you can sort of try and break down some of those barriers between actually executing workload in various places. And following on from that, Parsl also provides transparent wide area data management. So this is another effort to try and avoid this lock into a particular machine and try and abstract the locale in which you're actually executing something. So the idea here is that you can define this Parsl file object, which may be a local file if you've got a shared file system or running on your laptop. It might be a Globus accessible file that sits out there on some big storage system that might be at a university, a national lab, might be at a sequencing center, it might be anywhere. And Parsl will essentially transparently or implicitly perform those staging calls for you behind the scenes. So when you've actually got a task that needs to execute, it's dependent on this file that sits out there in China or something. It'll actually wire it across to the machine and then execute the task when it's actually ready. And so this is really useful for running on some of these larger machines that have large-scale data transfer node infrastructure for moving in and out large amounts of data. We also support HTTP and FTP for sort of direct data download staging to from execution. And we're working on sort of more specific caching models to avoid in shared file systems hammering away at it. If you've got a million jobs that are all hitting the same file, that tends to pull down shared file systems. I have spoken to a few people here, and I don't think Globus is a well-known technology in this community. I've included the link at the bottom there if anyone's interested in looking at Globus and its support for sort of very large-scale data transfer, synchronization, sharing. The final capability I wanted to talk about was app caching. So one thing we noticed very quickly when you start running sort of bigger workflows in Jupyter is that you can accidentally shift-enter, run cells that might actually be spawning a bunch of different jobs that run in different places. So very quickly we added this ability, and it sort of fits in with the whole checkpointing model as well. You need this ability to cache things. But the idea of being able to cache or memoization of a function so that you're not recomputing results that you've already computed before. So this works as you'd expect. You basically annotate an app saying, I want caching to be on here. Each time we make a call to that app, we'll store sort of what the parameters were that invoked it, what the files were, or what the objects were that went into it, and what the result was. And if you were to recall it, we look in our cache rather than actually rerun that job, which might go and take 10 hours on some machine elsewhere and use up your allocation. So we've been using Parsl probably for the last year or so in production science applications. I included a few examples here of some of the applications we've been applying it to. The first one on the top there is an interesting machine learning application where we're trying to predict the stopping power of electrons through materials. We've done a lot in bio, especially with sort of genome analysis workflows, a lot of information extraction, material science based on our association with the APS at Argonne, the cosmic ray showers, which is the example I showed before. We're very involved in an interesting collaboration as part of the LSST, the Dark Energy Survey, where we're trying to build all of their science analysis workflows in Parsl. The goal there being that instead of sort of keeping those workflows to a small group of people that know how to run them, broadening them to a wide group of users who can actually run and extend these analyses that are being used in production. So with that, I'll finish up. So Parsl, I think, provides this very implicit data flow model in Python that allows for this sort of simple, intuitive expression of quite complex applications. They're expressed directly in Python, so no need to learn another language. We've tried to make it as simple as possible with the caveat that, of course, we do need some information to be able to do this. We've applied it to a range of workflow models from interactive to machine learning to traditional HPC, HTC. One of the big advantages of Parsl is that it integrates with the sort of evolving science ecosystem, the SciPy world that I think obviously everyone here is very well aware of, the Jupyter environments for actually executing things in interactive modes, and then also with technologies like Globus that support 100,000 users to move, I think they've moved on the order of 300 petabytes of data over the last few years. Parsl, the code is separate from the specification of the computing resources and the location of the data, so this makes your Parsl script very portable. We're no longer locked into the single resource that we are using typically. And then there are a bunch of other features that I didn't talk about, like checkpointing, automatic elasticity, containers, more data transfer stuff, etc. So with that, I'll finish. The website is there. We have a temp MB environment that I'm sure if you'll go to, you'll pull it down. So there's also a binder link there if you want to go and get your hands dirty and run some basic Parsl scripts. So I should also say thanks to our sponsors. So particularly NSF has given us a lot of support on this project, Department of Energy through Argonne as well, and our home institutions. So thank you.
All right, I think we have time for a few questions. So quick reminder, if you can have one question per person, and please phrase your question in the form of a question.
Hello. So not sure if I can only have just one question, but they're quick. One is like, you said you could basically submit binaries on various compute nodes. You mentioned Theta. I had thought that if you launched your code on the back end of Theta, that they did not allow to then submit or to launch another binary. But you're saying through this process you're able to overcome that somehow.
So are you talking about, I don't quite get that. So you mean you can only submit one binary to a particular job queue, is that what you're saying? Yeah,
like through the QSub, you submit one binary. And,
so that's essentially how the pilot job model helps us. So by submitting a pilot job model, essentially we're deploying one job, which is a worker node, on that node we've provisioned, and then we're pushing arbitrary tasks to that node to execute. Does that answer the question? So QSub, we're never QSubbing individual tasks. We're not QSubbing a Python function or a wrapper around an application. We're QSubbing a job that will deploy this pilot job infrastructure.
I think so.
Okay, thanks.
Another question right here. For commercial codes that require licensing requirements, so there might be a given number of tokens available, if you provision a node, is it aware of those resources?
No,
we have to wait for the scheduler to figure that out.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we haven't looked at all at restrictions on licensing for commercial codes.
I mean, is that something you're looking at, though?
So we're working with a bunch of chemists who have licenses for codes, but normally they're not actually sort of hardened rules within the scheduling system. So they have their code, they have the binaries that they can deploy, and it's not enforced at a sort of you can run 10,000 of these at one time sort of model. So it's not something we've looked at specifically. It's an interesting one because I know certainly people with MATLAB and stuff have those constraints.
Same restrictions, yeah.
Something we should probably look at.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm just curious, so I'm coming with a bit of a Dask bias, so I was just wondering whether you've looked at Dask and how Dask could integrate into this kind of tool.
Yeah, so Dask is a great tool that I've used myself, especially for sort of data analytics things that I've done. So we have looked a little bit at how we could integrate with Dask, especially around the distributed piece. I mean, our focus has probably been a little bit different in that we're focused on these more sort of binary execution applications, wide area data staging, heterogeneous sort of compute environments. But I think Dask is heading in those directions. So I think it's something we should probably look at a little bit more, especially given the community of Dask users and sort of the flexible and easy to use sort of nature of it.
Any last questions?
There's one gentleman here.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the presentation. So I have one question. This has to do with the caching. So when you cache, since you are running on an HPC, a big system, and you have time constraint, if your job fails, do you have, are you able to checkpoint such that if you come back and you want to resubmit the job, you start from where you ended?
Yeah, exactly. So part of the reason for building the app caching was to deal with the notebook problems we saw, but the other part was to deal with checkpointing. So a lot of applications, I mean, some of these sort of stochastic analysis algorithms will fail quite frequently, and it's just people accept it. So we sort of had to bake in that caching so that we could actually periodically checkpoint not only where we were in the sort of DAG, so that we wouldn't rerun the whole DAG again, but also so that we could interface with applications that would checkpoint. So essentially you can loop on that application that's checkpointing itself. Application checkpointing is agnostic to Parsl, but we can support that checkpointing model by being able to loop around them. So yeah, I didn't talk about checkpointing at all, but that's a pretty central part of what we provide.
Okay, so then at what point do you clear the cache? Because how long will you keep caching? I mean, you have to manage memory.
Yeah. Yeah, so at the moment, it's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that question. It's you can configure where the cache is. You can configure the checkpointing cache. You can configure if you want to share that checkpointing cache between multiple applications. But I'm not sure if there's a way. I don't think we have a way, as far as I know. I don't think we have a way yet to sort of clear that cache, short of you going and deleting the checkpointing file yourself. That's a good question, though. It's something I should talk about with the team.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions for Kyle? He can take out in the hallway, and let's all thank Kyle again for the talk.